I'm aware that the noon hour lunch siren just went off in my community. And in the interest of time, I'm going to get started here so that we can give our speakers as much time as possible. I'm Kurt Callio. I am the president of the Ohio Watershed Professionals Association, which is a division of WWAMO. I'm going to read from WWAMO's self-description since it, I think, summarizes it as well as possible. For 50 years, WWAMO, which is the Water Management Association of Ohio, has served Ohio by promoting effective management of our shared resources, water resources. We're the only professional organization in Ohio focused on all water disciplines. Administered through 5 divisions and multiple interest areas, WWAMO provides a forum of open discussion, industry evaluation, and educational outreach for its diverse membership to communicate and learn. This luncheon is part of the WWAMO Luncheon Series. It's being hosted by the Ohio Watershed Professionals Association. And the Ohio Watershed Professionals Association is one of the divisions of WWAMO. We focus on waterways, streams, rivers, things of that sort, and their watersheds, and would love to have you be a part of OPA. If you're a member of WWAMO, you can join OPA simply by indicating that you'd like to be a part of that interest area, that division. I also want to point out that WWAMO's annual conference is next week on the 3rd and 4th, and cordially invite you all to be a part of that event, either the whole event or a single day. A lot of good things that will be happening on those days. It's, I believe, it's at the Crown Plaza. Is that correct? I'm hoping I remember that rightly. I do remember that rightly. Okay. So invite you to check out the WWAMO webpage and join us for that event. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Hippensteel, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Kurt, and welcome everybody. It's great to see all these faces. Hopefully we'll see you at WWAMO in person in a few weeks. And if you could just use the chat to introduce yourself to everyone, that would be great. And we're also going to utilize that chat feature for any questions that you have as we go along. So just type in your questions for the speakers into the chat, and Kurt will pick them up during our Q&A session. I am privileged to introduce our first speaker, and he is a colleague of mine in Southwest Ohio, Ryan McEwen, who is a professor in the biology department at the University of Dayton. And he'll talk a little bit more about himself, but I'm just here to say that a few years ago, I heard him speak about this topic, and as much as I thought I knew about rivers and macroinvertebrates and invasive species and the health of streams, I really had no idea about the research that he was doing and the implications that it has for restoration, ecology, and really just understanding our rivers and stream systems. So I'm really pleased that he's here today to talk about his work, and I think that you'll all really find it interesting and useful in the work that we're all trying to do across the state. So welcome, Ryan, and take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to pull up my presentation here. Let's see. Okay, good. Can you see my slides? Everybody hear me? Okay. So yeah, my name's Ryan McEwen. I work at the University of Dayton, and this presentation is going to be about a species called Amur honeysuckle, which is an invasive plant. If you don't know Amur honeysuckle, then you don't get out much, I would say. Go for a walk. You'll definitely see it. It's an important part of the flora here. Invasive species cause human or economic harm and are an important threat to biodiversity. Here's one called the silver carp, which you may have been hearing about. It's a water professionals meeting. So I thought it would be nice just to show an organism maybe that you're familiar with. This particular fish is a serious issue, just threatening the Great Lakes fisheries actually at the moment. And it's just to show you this image, it highlights what it means for an invasive species to be part of a system. There's so many of these, the level of density here is just almost astonishing. How do the species get to be so dense, and how do they influence the ecosystem? is a really important question. In fact, invasion ecology, the study of invasive species, really has a whole array of different really exciting things you can ask, or in science you can do. You can think about the features that enable a species to become invasive. What is it that enables those fish to be so dense and overwhelm the native species? What determines the invasibility of habitats? Not for the silver carp, but for other species, the habitat can influence the level of invasion, the quality of the habitat. And then what are the impacts do invasive species have on diversity, ecosystem processes, and actually human economy? This is silver carp is a good example of the species that could have really massive influence on the human economy of the Great Lakes. And also a recent one that came through our region, if you don't know about invasive species, was emerald ash borer, which killed a lot of ash trees and sort of created this issue where municipalities had to pay for dealing with all these dead ash trees in their jurisdiction. So invasive species are an ecosystem issue, but they're also an issue, an economic issue, and an issue for human communities. So I'm going to focus on what this one part of this sort of spectrum of interesting questions, and there's many others we could post here. And I'm going to focus on this species, Lonicera macchiae, the amber honeysuckle. As I said before, it's if you go on a hike, you'll see it almost in Southwest Ohio, especially, but across the state, really. It's since about 1970, let's say, become increasingly problematic species, and it's kind of on the top of mind for land managers if you've got a property anywhere in this part of the world. It was originally from Asia. There was a Soil Conservation Service breeding program at one point I think it was in the 70s and early 80s, where they thought it would be a good species for managing soil loss or helping out wildlife. It turned out to be a really bad decision on their part to promote this plant, because it became, as I mentioned, one of the most important problematic species really in Eastern North America. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing for the last decade, let's say, focus on how this invasive shrub impacts streams. So it's a different kind of area of focus. And I wanted to highlight this person, Dr. Rachel McNish. She did a lot of this work that I'm going to talk to you about. And also this person, Dr. Kevin Custer, he's presently at Pace Analytical in Inglewood. Dr. McNish is out in California now, working in Bakersfield as a professor. But I just wanted to highlight these two individuals because they contributed a lot of the work that you're about to see. Also, the project, some of it, not all of it, but some significant portion of the work I'm going to talk about was funded by the National Science Foundation. So I need to highlight those folks for funding my project. And I'm going to have 4 main points I want to make in the talk, and I'll try not to go too long. But here are the main 4 points, and I'm going to actually come back to them and provide data or talk to about experiments and research we've done in each of these areas. But here are the 4 points. Amber honeysuckle fundamentally changes the structure of forest along stream banks. So what you can see in this image, if you can see my cursor, I should have made my cursor larger here, sorry. Up here that's a winter stream with amber honeysuckle over it. And there's just not any native species that make a canopy like that. It's a unique physical structure. Amber honeysuckle contributes large quantities of materials to streams that are toxic to at least some macroinvertebrates. So this is an image of a honeysuckle berry in the bottom of a stream. And I'll show you that is actually toxic to some macroinvertebrates, which are the organisms that have formed the base of the aquatic food web. Amber honeysuckle invasion changes the aquatic community in fundamental ways. This is instead of a picture, is some data. I'll show you this, talk to you about it later. There's a fundamental shift happening in the streams that are invaded by honeysuckle. And the last point is a more hopeful point, which is restoration efforts, even at relatively small scales, seem to create a positive response in stream organisms. So it's not hopeless. So those are the 4 main points of the talk. And we'll circle back to, I'll come to each of them and provide you with a little bit of research to support this concept. So the first point is that amber honeysuckle changes the structure of forests along stream banks. And if you just go for a hike in the woods, you can see this, but we'll focus more on the specifics. So this is a former undergraduate who worked in my research lab out in the field doing some water quality testing. But you can see over his head here is a canopy of amber honeysuckle. It creates kind of like a cave. We used to say that in my lab, the cave effect of amber honeysuckle. you can see, and here's spring, and here's summer. In some cases, the actual branches end up in the water. So it's arching over the stream to such an extent that there's actually physical contact. But these are just some images to give you a sense, if you haven't stepped into a headwater stream and thought about the vegetation surrounding it. Sometimes folks who just think about kind of like green, that's all they're seeing, and they're not thinking about the species. But if you really look for this plant, if you're in a forest where there's streams, you'll see it in creating this kind of cave effect or canopy that really overarches the stream. Here's that image, a larger version of the image in winter, so you can just imagine. And there's lots of effects that this plant has when it creates this physical structure. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those effects. One of them I'm not going to point out, but is obvious, is shade. And so the streams where honeysuckle is present are a lot shadier and probably a lot cooler than other streams. But I do have data, but I'm not going to be able to share that. I have a big project as a National Science Foundation project. I'm not going to explain this design, but this was the experimental design. And I think just like for the purposes of this talk, you can just think a lot of things got measured. So we were putting plots next to streams. The blue here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, I should have changed the size of it, but right through the middle, the blue is a stream. And these are like the things we're measuring on the edges of the stream. We're also measuring things in the stream. And some of our plots or some of our streams had honeysuckle. Some of them did not. So we actually have this sort of, some streams are reference, that is to say there's no honeysuckle present. Some of the streams had moderate invasion, so some honeysuckle present, and some of the streams had heavy invasion. That's what you see over here on the over this word heavy. The green blobs are the honeysuckle, just to give you a visual. So this is kind of one of the experiments that we did, was just measuring the stream biology across a gradient of honeysuckle invasion intensity, if that makes sense. So it looks like this: reference streams, moderate streams, heavily invaded streams. And so, oh, and I have to put on top of it the native trees. So this is like the native overstory canopy, because we weren't working in sites that had only honeysuckle. It would be stream, honeysuckle, and then overstory trees, oaks and sycamores and everything you would expect. And we measured a lot of stuff. I can only give you a very small amount of what we've done there. And just to say, again, point back again to Kevin Custer, who was a postdoc in my lab. That's a full-time position. He helped with all of this, and this credit goes to him as much as me. And also to this person, Erin Roykamp, who presently works for the Five Rivers Metro Parks here in Dayton. I'm going to give you one little slide from her master's thesis work, which she completed about 3 years ago. Erin was really interested in coarse woody debris. So you can see her just like touching this tree branch. Coarse woody debris plays a really important role in the biology of aquatic systems, streams especially. And so we were really interested in how that honeysuckle invasion might influence the presence of coarse woody debris in streams. And we measured, as I mentioned before, across that gradient. From here you can see at the bottom of this figure, I'm not going to show you too many graphs, but here's one graph. The honeysuckle is heavy along the horizontal axis. As you go out, that's more honeysuckle, and as you go up in this figure, that's more woody debris. That's imagine this branch right here, or a piece of a tree. And the point here is that increasing honeysuckle in the forest, that is to say along the stream banks, was associated with decreasing woody material in the streams. So this is like changing the habitat structure for the organisms that live in the stream. The terrestrial invasion is altering the habitat for those organisms, which was a new idea and an interesting thing. And these are not kind of dark pictures, but just later I took some pictures. It wasn't in our manuscript, but you can literally see this. You can see that the woody debris actually gets caught and hung up and trapped in the, this is a tree. I don't know if you probably can't tell here but there's a tree literally caught here hanging in the honeysuckle. So we think this is actually a physical barrier, and that's limiting, at least in some cases, limiting the woody debris that's entering the stream. The woody debris then serves as the habitat template for the aquatic organisms, the macroinvertebrates especially, but also fish. And then that changes the structure of the ecological community. So that's the end of my first point. which is simply Amber honeysuckle fundamentally changes the structure of forests along stream banks. The second point I want to say, or want to make, is that Amber honeysuckle contributes large quantities of materials to streams that are toxic to at least some macroinvertebrates. And so if you spend any time hiking or in forests where you've got streams passing through them, and you go there in the spring, you can see this image, which is, those are all sort of spent flowers. And you wouldn't even think about this, but honeysuckle has very, very dense flowers, and they drop into the stream. What does that mean? It's an interesting question. And then in the fall, honeysuckle holds its leaves longer than native plants. I have data on that, but I can't share it too much. But if you head to a stream at a certain time of the year, you can see there's a very dense leaf packs of amber honeysuckle leaves in the stream. So this is a lot of material being contributed. And also, as I showed you before, these fruit. So there's a abundant fruit on honeysuckle. It's one of the features of the species invasion profile is incredible production of fruit. A lot of that, some of that's taken by birds, but a lot of it is excess and just drops. So where you've got honeysuckle hanging over the stream, there's a lot of fruit dropping in. So we were interested in what does that mean for aquatic organisms to have these deposits of very unique, interesting, and different kinds of materials into the stream, because there aren't any native species that have fruits of that at that level, at that density, at that magnitude that are dropping in the stream. So it's a unique structure or unique contribution. And we did an experiment like this. Again, I'm not going to give you all the details. It just would take too long. But my postdoc set up these little chambers so you can see this underwater chamber. And actually it captured specific macroinvertebrates, put them in the chambers, and then in the chambers put materials from honeysuckle. And then we had like controls, and it was an experimental design with controls and honeysuckle present. And then we measured the performance of the macroinvertebrates in these little cups, basically these in-stream microcosms is what we call them. It's a weird word, but anyway, the result, and this is just one slide, and again on the horizontal axis here, and this is a published paper, and you can contact me later if you want any of these papers, I'll send them to you. But on the horizontal axis is more fruit mass, and going up this graph is more mortality. And these are different kinds of aquatic macroinvertebrates that Dr. Custer had collected and put into these cups. So this is just evidence that the more exposure to honeysuckle, the higher the mortality. We have, with no honeysuckle present in the cups, no mortality. With a lot of honeysuckle present in the cups, in some cases, 100% mortality. So this is, and we have other evidence I'm not going to share with you. Oh, just one slide. So that was from fruit and berries. We also had a study that focused on leachate, so just the leaves. The graph is a little bit different, but the main point is, as you increase the percentage of Linister macchiae in the, again, microcosms, survivorship crashes. So this is evidence of some toxicity, actually, from the materials. Combine these two, the toxicity and the fundamental change of the structure changes the aquatic macroinvertebrate community in fundamental ways. This is my third point. And again, we're going to go back to this reference, moderate, heavy. I realize the methods are too hard to sort of track because there's so many different techniques and experiments we did here, but just kind of to let it flow over you, focus on the results. In those streams where we had honeysuckle present, honeysuckle moderate, honeysuckle heavy, we collected macroinvertebrates, brought them back to the lab, sorted them out, and then used analysis to assess the effects of honeysuckle. And I'll just give you one slide, and this is from Michelle Little, who was an honor student in my lab. She's now at Miami University doing a master's degree. But again, this is just one slide from a published paper, and we do have the paper I can share with you. But the point here is, as you go along this horizontal axis, heavier, more invasion is on this end. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but where there's more green blobs. And this is actually percent EPT taxa. So that's just taxa that are sensitive, macroinvertebrate taxa. And you can see, and this is actually a statistical test, that where you have heavy invasion, there's not as many sensitive taxa. So this is evidence that this is at the community scale now, at the community scale, the macroinvertebrates are influenced by amber honeysuckle presence along the stream bank. And so this is kind of the model, the overall picture, which is there's change. Amber honeysuckle invasion, here you see it along the stream bank, changes the structure and also changes terrestrial inputs, especially in autumn where they're dropping those leaves in, but also the fruit and also the flowers. This is actually altering the energy and nutrients and habitat substrate in the stream. So the in-stream habitat is changed. That's a basal resource for aquatic organisms. Aquatic organisms rely on leaf material, for example, or rely on woody debris as habitat. And then that changes the food web altogether. And so you have this overall change of the structure. And we have other evidence that I can't share with you, but the proportion of different functional groups in the macroinvertebrate community can change. We already just presented you data. I presented you data that the more sensitive taxa are not present where honeysuckle's there. And I also presented you with data that there's some direct toxicity on some of these organisms. And obviously the macroinvertebrate food web is the basis of everything else that happens in waterways. And if you think about the scale of the invasion of amber honeysuckle, which is basically the entire state, especially in where we are, Southwest and down into Kentucky, you can imagine that our streams have been pretty dramatically changed by this terrestrial invasion in the riparian area, the area adjacent to streams. And so my last point is, and I think I'm on time here, okay. The last point is that restoration efforts, even at smaller scales, seem to create positive response in stream organisms. So one thing we wanted to do, and this is back to my student Rachel, is ask a question of, well, okay, what happens if you remove honeysuckle? And so here's the experimental diagram. At the top in the blue is the stream. The green is like honeysuckle along the stream. The water is flowing this way where the blue arrow is pointing. And here's a native forest canopy, which I'm just going to put it on top. So this is what it looks like. Okay, that's an invaded stream. So we went to that invaded stream and actually removed honeysuckle along a portion of it. We measured macroinvertebrates in riffles in the stream before the removal. Then we removed honeysuckle and kept measuring it. So we had a removal and a control stretch of the stream. And again, I got to put the native canopy back on top. So this is what it looks like if you stand there and look up in the stream in the place where the honeysuckle is present. This is what you see on the, so my right, I don't know if it's your right, but the honeysuckle reach side of the stream is just a cave. If you, after I went with a chainsaw literally and took honeysuckle out, you stand in the stream and you look up and you see sky. So it's kind of obvious that there's something happening here. And so this is another published paper which I can share with you if you'd like. The simple thing to say is that removal effort resulted in a change, and this was over a 4-year period. Out here where I'm pointing, this is kind of a hard one to see, but where I'm pointing with these arrows, macroinvertebrate density increased in the same stream, just downstream from the honeysuckle. So just getting the honeysuckle out of the canopy created a measurable response, a statistically significant response in the macroinvertebrate community, even at that scale. So even, and again, the thing that's interesting about this experiment is upstream from this, as far as you could go, honeysuckle present. Downstream, honeysuckle present. In this one area, one part of a park, removing honeysuckle created a response in the macroinvertebrate community that was statistically detectable. So that's a positive. You know, we didn't keep continuing to measure it, but even over a 4-year period is a pretty long time, and we have pretty strong evidence that this is a positive effect. And so back to my main 4 points. Amber honeysuckle changes the structure of forests along stream banks. Amber honeysuckle contributes large quantities of materials to streams that are toxic to at least some macroinvertebrates. Amber honeysuckle invasion changes the aquatic community in fundamental ways, and restoration efforts, even at small scales, seem to create a positive response in stream organisms. So I want to thank many people who've worked on this project, and just to say it's one of the best parts about my job is working with all these undergraduates, and people get to launch their careers. Some of them become ecologists, some of them become consultants, and this woman became an ophthalmologist, so have different directions they head. And that's all I have. So I think maybe we'll wait till the end to take questions. I'm not sure what we want to do, but that's the end of my presentation. I just want to say, if you want to reach out to me, I'm easy to find online, mcewenlab.org. And you can send an email if you want the papers. I'll send them to you, or we could otherwise just exchange ideas and conversation. So thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason, for Ryan, for that presentation. As someone who's worked with streams for a number of years, it was really great to gain more insight into what Honeysuckle does. We've had a lot of groups in the area where I work that have worked to remove honeysuckle, and it's really good to hear that their efforts can have a really positive effect and are important. So thank you so much for that. We're going to ask you to put your questions into the chat. We will get to them later, but I want to make sure that we give Jason enough time for his presentation. I think we should have a good amount of time for questions at the end. Jason Brown Knight is a professional ecologist with 20 years of experience working on land, water, and wildlife management projects in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. He has a background in academic background in natural history, physical geography, and has had a focus on landscape ecology. He's spoken at local, regional, national, and international conferences on various ecological and conservation topics, including on management of invasive alien plants, with which he's done a lot of work for a long time. So welcome, Jason, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you, Kurt. Let me get mine pulled up here. All right, does everyone see that? Looks good. All right, great. And thank you, Ryan, for making the case even stronger of why we need to to mitigate invasive species, including Lorenzo Macchiai. There's a whole host of issues, and that was just a great explanation and really fascinating research. So thank you for your commitment and all that you've done. So like I said, I started a little bit here, but yeah, today what I want to talk to you about is integrative and invasive plant management, and essentially kind of the ecology of it and techniques and proven methods that help successful projects of mitigating these invasive species. So just to give you a sense of the agenda, and I actually jumped a little ahead here, but I'm going to focus on talking about the landscape ecology of invasive plant management. So kind of principles of what is landscape ecology in that perspective. How does that impact invasive plant management? And then how does it also impact the success of restoration projects? And then after we talk about those basic principles, we'll talk about invasive plant management. What does that mean? And then best practices for controlling woody invasive plants, including American bush honeysuckle. Then I'll have some information on available resources. There's some wonderful information that's out there. And then we'll have some time for questions after that. So let's start with talking about the landscape ecology of invasive plants. I like to use this photo that I have up here on this slide. This is actually an old growth forest in the Stone Lick Township area in Claremont County. It's an Illinois glacial till plain, a beautiful wetland forest. But one thing's interesting is, you would think it's this giant wetland, you probably wouldn't have honeysuckle in here. But what we found in this project site is in the tussocks and the hummocks, you had honeysuckle all over the place. So just understanding your landscape, you got to understand that invasive species is a landscape problem, and you really got to think about the ecology of your landscape when you may not think that something like honeysuckle would be an issue, since it's an upland plant in a wetland area. You might be surprised because they can just grow in some amazing places. So what is landscape ecology? So just some basic principles. And the research that I'm focused on and the methods that I do is I look at I'm interested in the distribution of species in geographic space and through geologic time. So we'll talk about a little more of what that means. But it's also an understanding and acceptance that ecological disturbance is a normal condition of ecosystems. And that disturbance in space and time is linked to ecosystem structure and function. And then we also have to understand and just accept that our modern landscapes today, especially in Southwest Ohio and other parts of Ohio, are human environment ecosystems. We just don't have landscapes, especially in Southwest Ohio, that haven't been impacted by humans throughout history, including impacts that are happening even today. So these are some basic principles that I know that I definitely focus on when I'm thinking about invasive species mitigation. So what does that mean when you're thinking about time in the landscape scale and landscape ecology? And that's to think about your site, and we think about natural succession. There used to be a time where if you cut down a forest or if you had a giant forest gap open up, it would be filled with native species and no invasives would invade that gap and we were good to go. Well, those times are long gone, especially in Southwest Ohio. So understanding where is your project site or your project area at in the successional process. Is it an early successional area? Is it a mid-successional area? Is it an old growth forest area? These are all things that you need to consider because the idea of mitigating invasive species is you're setting your site on the proper ecological trajectory that you're having that natural succession process function properly. Invasive species, what they do, like bush honeysuckle, is they have what we call arrested succession. So they stop and halt the successional process. So understanding the successional time frame and timeline of your project area is important in understanding the best approaches for managing invasives. In space, there used to be also a time where geographic boundaries existed and invasive species couldn't easily cross one continent to another. And as all of you know, those times again are long gone. This is an image of just shipping routes across the continent. So I'm not blaming all of invasive species, obviously, on shipping routes. I'm not trying to say that, but I'm just showing that invasive species are something that they're here to stay. There's more coming. There's more on their way. So it's something that it's a fight that we got to keep fighting because it's the one that we're never truly going to end, which makes prioritization and some of these points that I'm going to talk about that much more important. So because of these challenges, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this can be applied to a lot of things in life, but the adaptive ecosystem management approach. And so the idea there, and this especially applies to ecological restoration and invasive species in particular. And the idea, and I'll talk a little bit more with some examples here in a moment, is you begin with inventorying your project site. So if it's a riparian area, you start with inventory and find out, again, what is your habitat types, what invasive species are present, do your assessment of what level, what is the condition of the health of your environment, what level invasive species are you dealing with, use that information to come up with a plan, start implementing that plan based on your prioritizations, then you monitor the impacts and the effects of the plan that you implemented, and then you evaluate and you look for the indicators to see if you had success in your management strategy. And then you just go through the process again and again and again. And the trick is understanding that at any time in this process, you're going to have changes and that's okay. And that you got to be willing and understanding that this is a challenging process and that disturbance and change is a part of it. And so being prepared for that and being willing to adjust your plan based on sometimes your results won't work the way that you want them to, and being able to adjust to that treatment. For example, my very first big invasive species project when I worked for Claremont Soil and Water, goodness, back in 2006, I hired a contractor to treat 20-inch tree of heaven along a riparian area. They assured me if they cut them down and treated them with triclopyr, they would all die and go away and it would be great. Well, they did that. We paid them. A year later, we had about 1 million tree of heaven resprout. So that was a very bad lesson for me to learn. But we learned that lesson. We were able to move on and change our tactics. And it took a while, but then we were able to restore that site. So again, talking about the inventory, it's very important to understand your site. Now, this level of detail, you may not get to. This was a WRSP project that a colleague and I worked on, but it was about a 650-acre project site. And the first thing we did was extensive surveys to find out our habitat types, find out our water resources. And this laid the foundation of trying to understand our site and the landscape ecology of our site. From that, during that, we also looked at invasive species. So we looked at invasive species cover. Do we have low density, which would be less than 5% cover? Moderate to low density, 5 to 10%, moderate to high, 10 to 20, you get the sense, high density, greater than 25. Some of those high density areas, you end up with 300 or 400% because of the canopy cover is so dense, you can't even walk through the honeysuckle. And what this does is then you can see in 650 acres, that's a big project. That's a lot to take on. So from this information, that's where it's important to prioritize your project area. For this particular project, water resources was our primary concern. We had category 3 wetlands, we had class 3 streams, class 2 streams, exceptional warm water habitat. It was just loaded with wonderful water resources. And so we focus the prioritization and our funding resources for the grant ask on these particular areas. So even though it was 650 acres, we ended up focusing on about 100 to 120 acres for the particular project area. And that's very important because it can be very overwhelming on your project site. So prioritization is key. So then after you've really gotten to know your site, you're understanding the species that you're dealing with, you're getting a sense of your prioritization, what level of funding resources you might have, then we have to look at what are selecting our control methods. So there's a lot of questions, a lot of things that we have to consider when we are looking at these different methods. So first is the type of invasive species that's present. So what are you focusing on? It could be a myrrh honeysuckle, could be other woody invasives like tree of heaven. It could be lesser celandine, could be Japanese stiltgrass. There's a whole list of things, but they all have different treatment methods that work best for them. Also understanding the range of sizes of the invasive trees and shrubs, especially. You may be dealing with 20-foot tall honeysuckle that are 8 inches in diameter. Yes, they're out there. I'm sure a lot of you have seen them. Or you might be dealing with honeysuckle that is less than 1 inch in diameter. Those are 2 totally different methods that you might likely use, even though it's the same species based on the size. Also, number of plants and stems. There might be areas where maybe it's a low or a moderate cover area, and there's not a lot of stems. And so you can use methods that are different than, say, areas that have 300 or 400%. Foliar spray may be your only option for a 300 or 400% cover area, whereas cut stump or an injection method may work well for your low stem areas per square feet, or however it is, acres, however you judge your area. And then the size of the area needing treatment obviously is a big important part of that too. For instance, injection method, what I'll talk about here in a little bit later, that's a method where if you have, again, thousands of stems over, let's say maybe you have hundreds of thousands of stems over several acres, you're not going to be able to use an injection method. Again, you may have to use a foliar method or manual control. And then operational environment. What is the access to your site? What is the topography? That will also limit what your control methods are going to be for those particular sites. And then again, availability of equipment, labor, money. That's obviously a key one. What resources do you have? Again, all of this will go into your prioritization. And then also thinking about the native vegetation on site. Now, a lot of you have seen areas where it's, maybe it's lesser celandine, garlic mustard, bush honeysuckle, and tree of heaven. And that's your forest composition. That's scary. I live in Marymount. We have it here too. So I know it's out there. But there are areas where you may have a mix of those species, but also have a lot of native vegetation present. Be very careful in those areas, because obviously you don't want to kill the things that you're trying to protect, because that's not going to help anybody, because trying to start over from scratch is a very hard way to go. So you want to utilize what the native seed bank and seed source that you have as best as possible. So definitely try to use methods that are targeted and are going to prevent damage, to your native vegetation. Because again, there are times when you got to bring in the FECON. I've had projects where we had 20 acres that was 200% autumn olive. You had to crawl under it to get anywhere. That's what the deer were doing. So we had to bring in the FECON to shred all that down, took about 2 years of bush hogging and different spray treatments. And in I guess it was year 3, we were able to plant native seed, and now the autumn olive's under control and everything looks great. So in those cases, we were able to bring in the heavy equipment in that particular case. But the trick and the main point here is not one treatment will do it all. And that's why we call it an integrative pest management methods, because there's a lot of different factors that go into this. You might think that plants are easy to kill, but they can be harder than what you think. And even if you kill them one time, they're coming back, and you got to be prepared to make sure you have the best options as possible. So let's talk about some other important things, a little more specific to this particular, mitigation, integrative plant approach, excuse me. So the most important thing is early detection. So you can learn invasive species ID the best you can. A High Invasive Plants Council is a great resource for invasive ID information. As I showed you earlier, getting resources to detect, find out what's on your property. There are some easy resources out there. You don't have to have Esri or ArcGIS necessarily. Google Earth Pro. You can hand draw maps. A Gaia GPS is an app for a smartphone. There's other great apps out there. A lot of county GIS departments now have a ton of GIS resources and free online resources as well that can all be used to help you come up with an inventory of your property and really map out where these species are. And then make sure you're always walking your property. Even if you do a large treatment project, you want to make sure that you're continuing to walk that property 1 to 3 years or that project area to look for emerging invasives. Because then you got to follow that early detection with rapid response. And that's the search and destroy, hand pulling, grub eat, spot treatments. Because the key is, and a lot of you have probably seen this invasive species curve before, and unfortunately, a lot of us, we've waited way too far. If you look, you have if you look at the infestation on your left, and then the amount of time, typically we're up here in the right corner where the invasion is so bad, the costs are so much, we just don't even know what to do, and it's hard to even have success, and it's going to take a lot longer period of time. Whereas if we can find and start mitigating species on the left side of the curve, where the species are just starting to get established and we can get them before they get established, you're going to have a much better chance for success and setting that project area along the trajectory that you're going to want. And you'll be spending far less money when you do that as well. Now, if there's one resource I can point you to, this is what I think, or at least what I have found to be the most comprehensive guide that I have found out there about invasive plants. Plant invaders of the mid-Atlantic natural areas. Please research this. It's a free download. It's several hundred pages. It's rather comprehensive, like I said, and it deals with herbaceous, woodies, vines, everything you can name it, it's got it, and different methods that you can do to handle those. So definitely, I'll mention this again at the end. This is a resource that you want to download and get in your hands. It is phenomenal. And then it's another great, in particular to Laurentia Mackii, one of the best fact sheets that I've seen out there is actually from the OSU Extension. And it gives you, again, a lot of information about, why honeysuckle is a problem, how it originated, and then different treatment methods for, time of year, different herbicides that work. A lot of great information. Instead of me trying to teach you all exactly how to do it, just download that fact sheet. It is phenomenal. But I will talk a little bit about, with the time that I have left here, about these specific methods in particular. So first I want to start with just nature-based solutions, especially when we're dealing with riparian zones or around water resources. Sometimes just the ecological restoration project itself can allow opportunities for us to mitigate invasive species. Bush honeysuckle being an example, it's an upland plant. So if you're, let's say, a lot of times I've done wetland projects in Southwest Ohio, you can almost delineate the wetland boundary by the bush honeysuckle. So if you have opportunities, maybe the hydrology has been impacted, If you have opportunities to restore the natural hydrology, you may be able to drown out upland species like bush honeysuckle. So definitely consider that if you are looking at any larger scale ecological restoration projects, is restoring the function, the natural function of those ecological systems is always your best bet and have the longest range of success. And because, as I mentioned earlier, the early detection, rapid response is vital. And then I'll talk about all these methods just a little more detail in a moment, but I'll just kind of list them here. There are many. You've got cut stump treatment, basal bark, foliar spray, manual and mechanical, injection methods, a whole kinds of stuff on the menu here. So we'll start with cut stump treatment. And I'll go through these fairly quick because, as I say, there's a ton of information on all these methods out there on the fact sheets that I've presented. I highly recommend those. Obviously, as we're dealing, if I talk about herbicides here, I do have a pesticide license. I've had it since 2008. Follow pesticides rules, labels, safety, be educated, training, all that stuff. So throw that out there, disclaimer first off. But herbicides used responsibly and targeted can be effective. Cut stump treatment is a particular method that you can use mostly year round. You don't want to use it really during the height of the growing season because all the energy is going out. That doesn't do you good. You want to really capture the energy and the flow of going in because then it's taking that herbicide in. So typically fall, winter is your best time because it'll store in the root system and in the plant. When it goes to grow in the spring, it sends that herbicide through the system and kills the plant. It's a great method. It is labor intensive. The photos that you see down on the bottom right, those are all shrubs that were cut and just left. So you can see that it was a high density site with some large honeysuckle, but this method was a tremendous method for us that we were able to use and be effective. You can see that we used blue dye, and that helps us mark where the stumps that we've treated so we know areas where they've been. But a highly effective method. Again, refer to the fact sheets that I mentioned before, information on what kind of herbicide solutions, all those. And remember, around water resources, always used an approved water-safe herbicide. So basal bark spray is another method. This is an example of a project I did where the landowner had a bunch of calorie pear, but they wanted the calorie pear killed before it went to fruit. Which was an interesting situation. Usually I wouldn't treat calorie pear this way at this time of year, but this was a method. I used triclopyr, which is pre-mixed, or excuse me, Pathfinder 2, which is pre-mixed with triclopyr. I did basal bark spray from the root collar up to 8 inches all the way around. And this is a photo after 2 weeks of spraying, and these calorie pear are no more. So basal bark spray in the right environment can be effective. Foliar, another very effective. You may be looking at these photos and going, what in the world are you foliaring spray in winter? Which is a very good question. But high pressure foliar spray can be effective. And when you have areas covered in lesser celandine, this is a photo when I worked at the Cincinnati Nature Center. On the left with all the paths, you can notice the yellow is all lesser celandine. Everything flowing down in those riparian areas. On the right side, upper part of the photo, these are areas that the celandine had not escaped to and weren't invaded. So we were spraying in February for emerging lesser celandine using foliar application. And then the last method I'll talk about is the injection method. You can also see some hand pulling here. We pulled out. This is the Easy Lance. Which is an injection method that could work really well for low infestation areas and moderate infestation, especially for large things or for large stems. So here's some great resources that I mentioned before, and that's it for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason, and also for to Ryan for your presentations today. Ryan, I'm going to start by giving you a chance to reinforce anything that Jason said, since I saw you nodding your head on multiple occasions. So if there's anything that stands out for you that you'd like to reinforce, talk about a little bit. And the first question, I believe, let's see. I thought I saw a question earlier. Well, if you could post questions to the chat, I thought I'd seen one for you, Ryan, and I'm not seeing it right now, but I will look for it. And then, oh yeah, there is one question in the chat from Kevin Miller up at 12:27 that maybe you could respond to after any comments you might have. And then we'll go from there. So, Ryan.
That was just a comment. The only comment I would make is I found it a really interesting presentation, and I just agree with all of the points about early detection, especially I think are crucial in selecting the right method. The comment about tree of heaven and how that can get away from you if you don't use the right. So I just think, and pointing, I just liked it. That's all. I'll stop.
Yeah. Well, thank you,
Great.
Ryan. Thank you.
So the question here is, did you see if there were positive impacts to the reach downstream of the honeysuckle removal reach in your research?
No, we didn't. No, we didn't. That's a good question. We didn't measure below. If I was going to do, I think we did have we had it set up, and then there's some issue came about. I can't remember what the deal was, but the short answer to the question is no, we did not measure that, so I can't comment on it. But I do think it's a good point and something to study in the future, maybe.
Okay. Jason, Amanda's curious about good guidelines for removing honeysuckle along streams and rivers when there is almost nothing else growing. We worry about bank stabilization, erosion if we just remove it all at once. Are there good replanting strategies? We've considered leaving some root structures in place, cut stump, or doing it in phases, but any recommendations would be helpful.
Yeah, and that's a question I get a lot. Unfortunately for honeysuckle, the research has shown that the soils under heavily infested areas of honeysuckle are very similar in compaction to concrete and impervious surface. City of Cincinnati did a wonderful study to show that. So honeysuckle, because it's a very shallow rooted plant, really provides very little in soil stability or soil erosion control. Now, having said that, in areas where you have bare soil and it's nothing but honeysuckle, we certainly understand that concern. And so in that situation, an injection methods, basal bark, cut stump, things that are less intensive would be your best bet, where you can allow, those root systems and that veg to reside where it's at, especially on steep banks. But the trick there is having that plan for restoration of trying to get other woody invasives established in that area, and that takes resources and time. But things like pawpaws, spice bush, bladder nuts, native, fast growing things, species that deer don't tend to like. Those are things that especially spice bush and pawpaw, those are things that you can try to get established in upland riparian zones that can try to outcompete that honeysuckle. But again, honeysuckle is providing very little to no benefit to soil stability. So the idea there is you got to restore the entire function of that area by not just removing the invasives, but having a plan and a strategy in place to get as many natives established as possible.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. Are there any other questions that folks have? Please, I'll watch the chat and see if anything else comes up. Would love to see anything that you have. So another question, how soon after removal should one plant?
A lot of that depends on the level of your infestation. So if you have a highly infested area, it's going to take 2, maybe 3 treatments before you're going to have success in that area. So a lot of it depends again on the level of success, the level of infestation, what species you're dealing with, and the health of the environment in particular. Because very rarely can you go into an area, remove honeysuckle, and then plant and have success. Because you have to go back until you can get invasive species cover to where it's on a trajectory to where you're having less and less. That's when you want to go into plant. So you got to remember that never is an invasive species project a one and done solution. In my 20 years, I've never found that to be the case. Typically, you're looking at 2 to 3 treatment cycles. And then even once you get to that period and you're ready to have a trajectory where you have less resprouting, you have less biomass of invasives out of the area, where you can get the conditions that you need for native vegetation to thrive, you're still going to have to come in every probably 3 to 5 years and do the early detection rapid response for invasives, or they will be back.
Another question here. We are concerned about residual effects of the chemicals used in the honeysuckle. How quickly can you replant after using chemicals?
Well, in regards to, I mean, if you're talking about cut stump or basal bark in those situations, I mean, really within 24 hours, I mean, that's, you got to stay out of the area 24 hours after treatment. But those particular methods, injection and well, are so targeted. The idea is then none of that herbicide material is being carried off site, being carried away from your target. Even if you get a tiny bit of spill that runs down your stem that gets, along that edge right there, as long as you're applying that herbicide where there is no moisture, no rain forecasted 24 hours before, 24 hours after, so you have dry, good conditions, then that herbicide should stay exactly where it is that you're applying. And so you should be fine. If it's a foliar treatment, a lot of times then it depends again on time of year. If it's in the fall, again, you allow a couple days and you're good to go, because you're really not going to see the results until spring when it goes to resprout, and nothing will resprout. If you do a foliar treatment to say turf grass or celandine or something like that, you are going to probably wait 2 weeks or so to see how effective your treatment was.
Okay. Is there any difference between cutting stumps high or low, flush with ground level, before applying herbicide?
So yeah, I typically, it's hard to go flush with ground level just by the nature of the way honeysuckle and a lot of, woodies will grow. But I do try to go as low as possible. Because, mainly there is because then you got tripping hazards. I've seen people where they'll cut it off high and they say, well, I want to come back later. But if you do cut stump treatment, you're cutting and you're applying the herbicide right away within 10 to 20 minutes. 20 minutes may be too long. Within 10 minutes, you are applying that herbicide. Maybe even right away is their best method. If you wait too long, it's just not going to be as effective, or you'll have to use more herbicide. So,
do you know if carbon sequestration is better or worse with honeysuckle? If so, are there estimates in the difference in carbon sequestration?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that.
Thank you.
I think, so I just wanted to, before I say that, I just thought your answers are awesome, Jason. I just love listening to what you're saying. My answer to this question is that I don't think it's been measured. I don't think anyone knows for sure. A quick thing to say is, generally speaking, larger trees are better for carbon sequestration, generally speaking. So like a huge, if you can imagine, just picture a white oak in your mind, or some really large tree. Tree size and tree height and tree girth are the best predictors of how much carbon a tree is storing. And so if you get honeysuckle off the site and can establish a native tree canopy, those trees are 75 feet tall, you're going to, I would predict, hypothesize, store a lot more carbon than you would if honeysuckle is present, and it's got this arrested succession, as Jason was talking about before.
Great, thank you. What species have you seen naturally move into riparian areas that were previously managed for honeysuckle? Japanese honeysuckle, lesser celandine, good stuff?
That varies, and a lot of it is your timeline as well. Is there a good chance that your infested area in Southwest Ohio, you're going to just see garlic mustard pop in right away? Yes, there's a good chance of that. That seed bank is there. But again, that speaks to the duration. Again, this is over time and throughout time. It's taken a while for invasives to get here, so we got to understand it's going to take a while to get rid of them. I've seen projects that Great Parks and Hamilton counties have done where if you look at photos when they began and then you look photos 10 years later, you can't even tell that those systems were even ever invaded by invasive species. They are phenomenal. So it can work, but it just takes time. So yes, right away in the first 1 to 3 years, could you see other invasives that you're probably going to have to deal with? Yes, and you need to be prepared for that. That's just remember, we're in human impacted environments where disturbance has been prevalent for a long time. And these invasive species are thriving and are loving these environments. So just remember, it's got to take time and be patient.
Thank you. Is honeysuckle kept in check in its native ecosystems? What keeps it in check there?
Yeah, in its native ecosystem. So in China, is that what the question is? Yeah.
Where it comes from? Yeah.
Yes. So the answer to the question is yes. In fact, I knew is it kept in check. I know someone, I didn't do this, but I knew someone who was a graduate student at Wright State University, and she was in contact with some botanists in China and wanted to visit to see honeysuckle there. And it's actually an occasional plant in forests. So imagine if you know the plant witch hazel, or maybe rusty blackhaw in our forest, something you might see, but rarely. Not rarely. You might need a botanist if you didn't know the plant to take you to it. So it's nothing at all like what happens in our flora. You know, where you can't walk through the forest because it's so heavily invaded. It just doesn't behave this way at all. The reason why is complicated. Part of it is probably herbivores controlling it, like insects specifically, pathogens specifically. There's an escape piece to this, where, and by the way, our species do this as well. Acer negundo, which is box elder, I don't know if you know that plant, but it's a terrible invasive species in Italy and stuff. So some of our native species are terrible invaders other places. The thing that drives that, again, is escaping enemies. But the other thing with honeysuckle that's complicated is there was that Soil Conservation Service breeding program. And so it's pretty different probably than the native species as well, because there were plant breeders working with it for a while to try to make it more vigorous, literally, which was a terrible idea, or someone had stopped them. Don't do that. Not good. But they did a good job of making a plant that's very, very successful. So those are some of the aspects.
Thanks. In a heavily infested riparian area, what would you estimate the time frame is to exhaust the seed bank of honeysuckle, assuming the trees have been removed?
You know, that's a great question. I'm not sure I could put a particular, I'm not sure I've done enough, you know, standard scientific research to, you know, to be able to answer something like that. You know, again, there's so many conditions that, you know, it's just so many factors that just go into that. And so I think the key there again is, you know, just understanding all of the elements of your landscape. So looking at hydrology, looking at soils, your soil condition, looking at existing canopy, you know, is there a native seed source nearby? If you have nothing but, so if you clear 50 acres of honeysuckle, but you're surrounded by 1,000 acres of honeysuckle, guess what? That seed bank is going to be there forever because it's got sources nearby. And so that's what you got to look at. If you have a site that is 400% honeysuckle and you have nothing but invasive species around you for miles, you're going to have a really tough time taking on a big project. So you really got to prioritize what your goals are for that project. But if you have areas where you have native, you know, seed sources nearby, that'll give you a sense, how close are they? Because that's what's going to move into your area to repopulate that. Because again, you're kind of, since you have arrested succession, the process has stopped and has probably stopped for decades. So you're restarting the clock. That takes time. So it's not a year, 2 years. You may see improvements in a year or 2 years. So I'm not telling you not to do it. Please do it. Just know that you're trying to restart the succession process to put it on the trajectory moving forward. Sorry for my long-winded answer.
Let me just chime in to agree with Jason on this, and also say, I think the seed bank of honeysuckle is very brief. It doesn't last in soil much at all, maybe even past a year. But the problem is what Jason is saying is the seeds are still coming in forever. It's the seed rain that you have to deal with.
Well, I'm thinking of it, if you're willing to have folks contact you by email, if you would put your email address perhaps in the chat so that people could contact you. If you'd rather not, that's fine too. But if you're open to that, I'd welcome that. I have another question. We have Johnson grass. Any recommendations or thoughts for this invasive?
Johnson grass. Yeah, that's a tough one. And that one, you're usually responding. Now, again, if it's an upland riparian zone that you're looking to do a wetland project or a stream restoration project, you can flood it out. So I will say that. Outside of that, the one things that you want to do is a combination of mechanical control, actually removing the seed. So you're getting rid of that seed bank. Then also your foliar sprays as well. There's a ton of different methods that you can do. There are grass-specific herbicides that work well for it. Trying to get it early in the year where it's really beginning to emerge is really where you want to get it. You don't want to wait until it's already shooting up and starting to seed out and flower. But there are some great fact sheets and information on how to treat Johnson grass. So I would recommend put some research in there. And it may even be in the Midwest Plant Invaders guidebook as well. So take a look. But there are some effective methods. But yes, it's definitely one to prioritize because it can become a major problem.
I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm so grateful to both of our speakers for the wonderful information that you provided. This is as you are well aware, a major issue in our state and affects so many waterways. And to learn more about it, I know that I have learned a great deal from both of you. So I'm really grateful for that. For those of you who may have come on a little later, this presentation has been recorded and would be available to people to watch after today. I'd like to thank all of you for attending today and remind you that I'd love to have you be a part of the WAMO conference next week on the 3rd and 4th. And so thanks so much. This wraps it up for today.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.